Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alancia and Steely. We are coming to you in your different staff time to chat with you about a really important topic that both Alancia and I are really passionate about, looking at conflict mediation and kind of exploring more what conflict means to us. So thank you for spending some time with us today. We're excited to talk with you about this really important topic. So as we get started, we of course want to begin by sharing what our goals and outcomes are for our time today. Our first one is relationships and communities, of course. And the outcome for that we really want to tune into is design and implementing strategies for effective conflict resolution. Next, we want to touch on equity and justice, as that is oh so important. And in this one, we want to talk about how to engage in dialogue to deepen understanding, respect, and empathy for others. And lastly, we want to hit on social responsibility as well, and with that, focus in on making informed choices for the safety and well-being of others. All three of these, and of course more learning goals and outcomes too can relate, but these are the three we really wanted to zone in on together during our time today. As we jump into this topic of conflict, we wanted to start by asking, what do you think of or what do you feel when you hear the word conflict? We recognize it can mean a lot of different things to different people, and while we do have an image there, to give you some words to build off of, we recognize there are a lot of words and thoughts and feelings you could have around this. Part of that's because of how we associate conflict. Part of that could be past experiences coming up for us. I know sometimes that can look or show up in physical ways as well. So example, your heart might start racing a little bit, or maybe you get really tense and your shoulders tense up, or perhaps you get like a stomach ache, or makes you want to move and get out of the space. So we recognize not just the thoughts and the feelings, but there could be also a physical response to that as well. So we're going to just ask you to pause this video for a moment and share around the room within your staff, what is your word, or a couple words if you want, when you hear of conflict. Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that first reflection, getting you thinking about conflict and kind of setting the stage for our conversation. Next, what we posted up here is a slide of some words that have come to mind. These actually were from a session last year that I had the chance to do with Dustin around conflict with some of our returning staff, and these were words that they used. And so since we can't be together and ask you in a live setting, we thought we would share some words from the past that paraprofessionals, some of you may have been in that session, or some of you might remember that, but we wanted to share those with you and have you take a second and kind of sit in that and really think about this. As we do this as well, we're thinking about conflict, but as we mentioned, we're going to talk about equity and justice, social responsibility, and relationships in communities as well. And so part of that piece too, we want to talk about culture and cultural competence and really work towards building those skills so that although these words and the feelings and experiences we have can be a little scary, overwhelming, again, some of those other words, emotional, stressful, yucky. We want to make people feel more comfortable in that. And so next, Alancia is going to take a few minutes and really define more what conflict is, and then we're going to, from there, jump into cultural competence and move forward, and hopefully at the end give us a chance to practice some of those skills and practice those communication pieces that we hope you can utilize within your staff, within your residents, and in life, because these are really important life skills beyond being a staff member. Conflict is going to be part of our lives forever, and we want to make sure we have the skill sets and the experiences to work through them effectively and hopefully strengthen the relationships in the process.
Conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from others in achieving their goals. Or, more simply put, conflict is a discord of action, feeling, or effect, antagonism or opposition, as of interest or principles, such as a conflict of ideas. Oftentimes, when we think of conflict, we think of it as this big, scary word, or something that means that we failed if we find ourselves in it. But conflict is really naturally occurring. It's not big, it's not scary, it's commonplace, just as commonplace as communicating. We are communicators. Humans are communicators. And we know that we can't not communicate. Even when we aren't talking, we pick up on body language, facial expression, or even silence as means of communication. How often have you heard a resident say that those things are proof that their roommate doesn't like them or that their roommate is being disrespectful? We want to move away from that. We really want to normalize conflict. And we want to do this so that people are less likely to avoid it because they understand it's impossible to do so. So even when they don't have the skills to navigate conflict on their own, they understand that they will have to take action in order for things to change and are more likely to ask for help. So we want to allot some time for identity-based reflection. We're going to have you all answer the following 4 questions with your staff. 1, name 3 parts of your identity that really shape who you are. 2, how do these identities shape your beliefs? 3, how do your beliefs show up when you are in conflict? And 4, does identity play a role in conflict/conflict resolution?
Thank you for taking a couple minutes with your staff to do some reflection and sharing around the idea of social identity and how that fits into shaping who we are, what we believe, and how we approach ourselves in conflict. And now we're going to broaden that idea of the individual and kind of think the bigger picture around culture and how those individual parts of who we are play into shaping culture. And so before we do that, we're going to define culture, and then Alansi is going to give some examples of what cultural differences can look like. So first, the idea of culture. This is an umbrella term which encompasses the social behavior and norms found in human societies, as well as knowledge, belief, arts, laws, customs, capabilities, and the habits of individuals in these groups. So why would we want to talk about culture with conflict? Well, different cultures have different ideas of how things work. So when we think about that, we can think about clothing, hairstyles, professionalism, ways to communicate, and ways to greet each other and to take care of one another. All of those things can be different based on the culture you were raised in, and even the culture that you choose now as an adult at CMU. From different academic programs to leadership experiences, down to the culture even of your own staff. So when we think about culture, we're going to expand that further and think of some cultural differences that could be at play in different room situations or in different relationships that definitely shape the way we might see the world and our lens of how we're going to view conflict.
These are some examples of cultural differences. Keep in mind, these are just examples. It is not an exhaustive list, and it does not apply to everyone from said culture. Culture is not a blanket statement. It doesn't cover everyone easily. It's complex and unique to the individual. But with that in mind, here are the examples. So religious differences, hijabs versus habits, food differences, folks who don't eat pork or who must eat kosher, language differences. In Korean greetings, they change based off the age or relationship to the person you're speaking to. So, for example, if you're talking to your older brother, you would call him Oppa. Or gendered languages like Spanish, Italian, and German, where even the individual words are rooted in a specific gender. There are differences in socioeconomic status. For example, lower income students may have challenges with acquiring resources such as textbooks, laptops, or toiletries. Geographic location. So we have a lot of students that are from different states. Not everyone's from Michigan. For example, with folks from the South, right, there's the Southern accent or using sir and ma'am as signs of respect. The whole debate of pop versus soda, or like me, for example, who's from Chicago, and I had ready, available access to public transit, and so I don't have a license. Racial differences, a big one is hair texture, style, products, the amount of products, how much space all those products take up in a room, clothing style, family background, differences with orientation and gender. Some folks who are a part of the LGBT plus community may use partner or significant other instead of boyfriend or girlfriend. And then there is disability or ability status. So in terms of mental and physical health, there may be differences in bathing habits, sleep disturbances, if someone has an emotional support animal or keeps insulin in the fridge. Cultural competency and conflict. So we've talked a little bit about what conflict is, But now we need to make sure that you all understand what cultural competency is. So, cultural competence is that ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures. Cultural competence encompasses being aware of one's own worldview, developing positive attitudes towards cultural differences, gaining knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, and developing skills for communication and interaction across cultures. Or, culture is an essential part of conflict and conflict resolution. Cultures are like underground rivers that run through our lives and relationships, giving us messages that shape our perceptions, attributions, judgments, and ideas of self and other. Though cultures are powerful, they are often unconscious, influencing conflict and attempts to resolve conflict in imperceptible ways.
Thank you, Alancia, for those wonderful definitions. So, as we kind of bring it back to thinking about how we apply this to conflict, we have a few questions for you. So, we are again going to ask you to pause this in a minute here and take some time first to individually reflect. So, if you have some paper in front of you where you can take it out and make some notes on these questions here, and think about this, and then we'll ask you to share in your group, whether you want to do a pair share or a large group discussion. Either is fine with us. So this first one is, can you make a list of cultural differences that you think might show up in your community? What do you know and what do you need to know? Second, we are going to ask a couple questions related to specifically parapros that are returners and new parapros. So for our returning parapros, how have you seen some of these cultural clashes play out with residents in the past? So thinking about specifically cultural differences and how those have shown up perhaps in roommate conflicts or other conflicts you've seen when those cultural differences are at play. And for new paraprofessionals, just because you're new doesn't mean you don't have a plethora of experiences that you may have had personally or things you've experienced as well. So have you experienced any cultural clashes, or have you noticed that in other spaces with previous roommates, classmates, or just things that you've witnessed through your time in your life or here on campus? So how does culture play a role in that? So again, if you can take a few minutes, do some personal reflection, and then do a pair share or a group share, depending on your staff and what works best for you. So I'll see you in a few minutes.
It is super important to know that resolution is possible. None of what we've talked about thus far matters if we do not perceive resolution as possible. This is the true framework for all of conflict mediations. Everyone must agree that resolution is the end goal and that they are willing to participate, listen, and ultimately compromise. So we as mediators must also see resolution as possible. If we go into a mediation with an attitude or tone that really seems like, this is out of reach, this is not going to happen, these folks just need to move, the residents will pick up on that. And this is where being neutral is key. So how can we recognize our own approach to conflict as well as others? With a conflict style assessment, so there's a link there. Your hall director will share that with you all, make sure everyone has it. It'll take between 15 and 20 minutes to complete the assessment, and we recommend that you take a screenshot of your results. I could not find a way to send it to yourself. Even printing it was wonky at times, so please take a screenshot, use the snipper tool if you don't have Apple products, to make sure that you have your results and can review them later. In order to help understand your results, I'm going to give a brief synopsis of the potential outcomes. Their conflict style, that'll be your top percent. The owl, turtle, shark conflict management style with the animals, that's just there for a reference for those of you who may be more familiar with that, as I know a lot of student leaders here at Central have done that one before, but the results will be similar. Either collaborating, avoiding, competing, accommodating, or compromising. So I'm going to read through very briefly what those are, and you'll get a longer synopsis with your results, but just to kind of help make sure that you all understand and that everyone understands everyone's, not just their own. Right? So collaborating or problem solving, owl. They tend to want to discuss all the details of a problem and work through it together so that everyone gets what they want in the end. Avoiding, turtle. They often keep opinions to themselves in conflict so as not to continue or escalate the conflict. Competing, shark. They know the result they want in a conflict situation, and they go for it. Accommodating, teddy bear. They often focus on supporting others in conflict and are adept at placating people in uncomfortable situations. Compromising, fox. They tend to think about what they are willing to give up and hold on to, and try to gear communication to focus on this give and take for all parties. So hopefully that helps everyone kind of understand. But again, when you look at your results, it'll give a overview of all of them. And I really like this conflict style assessment because it tells you all of them. You recognize a little bit better that everyone participates in each one of these types of conflict styles at some point or another. For example, for me, avoider is only 25%, but I do avoid conflict when I don't see resolution as possible. So that's why it's really key that I understand that resolution is possible so that I don't avoid it and I go for it and I try and make sure that things get resolved. We added this photo/chart because I think it also really helps frame where folks fall in terms of degree of cooperativeness versus degree of assertiveness. I think a lot of times when we go into mediations and roommate conflict especially, we see that. We see folks who are willing to cooperate, participate, really want to figure out what's going on and how to make it right. And then we see folks who are very assertive. And that can go either way of they are sure in their convictions that this is the outcome that they want, or they're just assertive in how they participate in the mediation. They're very direct, they're very blunt, very to the point. And so you start to see or start to notice where folks fall in terms of actual conflict style. So if someone is an accommodator or collaborator, they're pretty high up on that degree of cooperativeness, right? And if someone is an avoider or competitor, they're pretty low. But if they're assertive, right, then collaboration and competition, they have a lot more in common, and accommodation and avoidance have a lot more in common. And compromise is kind of that central, ideal kind of place to be, because compromise is really what's going to bring around that resolution. And so when someone is willing to compromise, they're really in that middle of cooperating and being assertive. They know what they want, but they're also willing to hear everybody else out and understand what they have to give and what they have to take in order to reach resolution.
So now that we've spent some time really sitting and thinking about our own individual conflict styles and our identities, we want to take that and kind of broaden it for a minute here with this next reflection you're going to do on your own and then with your staff. The reason why we wanted to do this as well as part of this ending part is we recognize that it's important not only to understand yourself for the sake of the way you might interact with conflict and how you might view it, but we're talking a lot about how you interact with residents, but we also want to acknowledge that you as an individual staff member could have a conflict with a resident sometime or a conflict with a room. And so we want you to, of course, continue to be aware of that. But most importantly, conflicts that could show up within our staff or other spaces that we're in. Again, as I mentioned earlier, conflict is a part of life that we are always going to be working through and dealing with. And part of that is, conflicts that will come up on our staffs as we continue to get to know each other and try to understand each other better and work towards common purposes. This is going to happen. So the more that we can understand one another, especially now, right, we have this opportunity during paraprofessional development to deepen those relationships or continue to build upon the foundation. We want to make sure we take time to do that. So the first question is, we want you to think about 3 positives about your natural conflict style. And the reason we said natural is because that's right, through this exercise, what you kind of lean towards most. But again, we want to keep in mind that we want to exercise all styles and work towards developing skills around different styles. But today we're focusing on that reflection of where we show up individually. So again, 3 positives around that natural style. The second one is 2 challenges or things that your conflict style may present, right? So we know that for every positive, there can be a challenge that comes with that. So we want you to think about what those challenges might be, or if you're maybe already aware of those, maybe what's one thing you want to improve upon in that area. And then lastly, we want you to share one thing you want other styles to know about you in your natural style. And the reason we included this one is that sometimes, even when we're sharing about different parts of who we are, the positives, some of the areas of strength or growth, it's easy for us to fill in the story, fill in the blanks with our own story, and not give people the opportunity to kind of make meaning of that. And so with this one, it's kind of your chance to maybe share something that you get misunderstood for, or that, maybe you just want them to know about your style that you're really passionate about. So again, we're going to give you about 3 minutes to do this individually and reflect, and then we'd ask for you to take 5 minutes within your staff to talk about this as a group. Thank you. Awesome. So we hope that was a meaningful conversation with you and your fellow staff members. Next, we definitely want to take a moment to pause and give you a break. So we're going to give you 5 minutes to stretch or take a brain break. Just get up, move around if you're able to, or as you want. Maybe use the bathroom, maybe get a drink of water, whatever you need to do, but take the next 5 minutes for you just to pause and kind of recharge. So we hope you enjoyed your break. And as we get ready for our next section here, I put up again the how do you feel picture here in a different prompt to kind of center us in what this next part of our presentation is about, which is helping equip us with skills and experiences to be good conflict mediators for others. So the statement is, when I hear, I'm having a problem with my roommates that needs to be fixed. So whether you're new or you're a returner, I'm sure all of you have given thought to the fact that at some point a resident is going to come to you and say some version of this. And so we hope to spend the next section together talking about what are some principles of conflict and what does that mean and how does that relate to my role as a mediator, as we want to equip you with some skills and help you empower yourself and empower our residents to communicate and to be thoughtful and to work through conflicts that come up so we can hopefully strengthen relationships. So first, just kind of a quick concept to think about when we're thinking about conflict is principles of conflict. So one thing to keep in mind is we have both the content and the process. So the content is, what is the topic, or what result or outcome do we want? And then the process is, what will be the communication style? What do I think or feel about how we will work through the experience? And it's important that we hold both of these principles together equally when we're working with residents or we're working with people trying to help mediate their conflicts. So next we're going to focus on a little bit of skill building around facilitation. As you do notice, it's the shape of like a hidden Mickey. So the reason I picked that is for Disney fans out there, or even non-Disney fans, hidden Mickeys are kind of this semi-obvious thing that we think we might know, but sometimes we see them, sometimes we don't. So I don't want to assume what we know and what we don't know. And what this hidden Mickey is focused on is the proactive part of conflict resolution, which is actually the first roommate agreement that everyone will be facilitating here in the coming weeks. The reason why we think of this as the proactive part is because this is the real opportunity to set the tone, to bring the rooms together, and especially this year, we really want to focus in on building those roommate relationships and room dynamics so we can have as positive and meaningful of an experience as possible. So with that, I'm just going to share some tips and ideas for how to go about facilitating it. I know when I first started as a staff member, although I had some leadership experiences, I was never really taught how to facilitate conversations or how to facilitate roommate agreements. So one of the things we really wanted to do is take some time to share with you some skills or some specific strategies you can use. And then after this one, we're going to move into some specific skills and strategies for conflict and how you can approach that. So with that, again, there's 3 points to this. The first is the environmental setup. And what we mean by that is location. So we know that's very important. We're going to work with residents, whether that's online or in person. Both of those options are there for you. And as Alex said earlier in the eRes Life session, there's a really cool online roommate agreement you can utilize. But with that, you want to make sure people are comfortable. You want to think about the space that you're setting people up in. So space can be virtual again or in person, socially distantly, of course. But what I mean by space is, how are things spaced out? And how are they engaging? So space in a physical sense could mean, I suggest that you look at using a circle or something around that, because you don't want to be across from each other and look like you're you're running it, which you're facilitating it, but you're not running this. This is their room. We want to get them kind of facing each other, able to make eye contact, able to look at one another, and making sure there's equal distance and everyone's feeling equally a part of the process. If you do this online, one strategy, although you can't really sit in a circle that way, is to make sure everybody turns their camera on. I know it's really easy for people to just want to kind of tune in an audio way, but we really want to try and capitalize on the nonverbals that we can use. So it's really important to try and get people to all do that and be part of the process and be active. The last question is, have they spent time together? So I know we're going to be eager to want to facilitate these, but it'll be important to do some pre-work leading up to the roommate agreement to make sure roommates are spending time together. We don't want to assume they are. Just because they share a space doesn't mean that they're connecting to one another. So maybe before a roommate agreement, you might need to do a little community builder to help them kind of break the ice, as sometimes it can be hard. Even when you're sharing space with people, to know kind of how to communicate. So you want to make sure that they've had a little bit of time to warm up before you dive into these really important topics. So for the agreement itself, we're going to talk through some steps. Of course, making sure you look over it in advance so that you're familiar and kind of comfortable with the content. But when we get into the agreement, we want to do a few things to kind of help us set up ourselves for success. And that first is we want to set some ground rules about how the communication is going to go. And again, you want to set a serious tone, but also set a tone that you're there to build a relationship and you're there to have hopefully fun with them too, because this is a great way you can connect and build relationships with your residents as part of this process. As you're going through the content, you want to make sure that you're asking follow-up questions and encouraging people to be specific. So I can think of so many roommate agreements that I've gotten back that say, everybody's cool, or we'll just take care of our own stuff, or whatever. And inevitably, most often those rooms end up having trouble, and then we go back to those agreements and we have trouble. So whenever those come to me, I always work with staff and work with myself too to think, what are some really specific intentional questions I could ask? So not just like, hey, you need to write more here, but what are questions I could do or help guide them to understanding that topic a little bit better? So really think about that and how you can be intentional in that way so you can help them think through things that maybe they just haven't thought about before. And lastly, you really want to make sure everybody's involved, and if everyone isn't, you can change it up, mix it up, meaning like maybe the group conversation is a lot of pressure for someone, so maybe there needs to be a little time to reflect and more personally, and so take some time maybe to journal. If they're struggling coming up with ideas, maybe they need to take a break. Maybe you need to kind of chat and check in with people one-on-one. So remember, if things don't seem right, don't just force it to get it done. Slow it down a little bit and make sure everybody's doing okay and everyone's feeling like they're part of the process. Lastly, we want to talk about debriefing. So this is the closure process to the experience. So of course, as you're facilitating, trying to make sure everybody's comfortable, also tuning into the dynamic of the room, as you can learn a lot about how you can support them, how you can encourage them through this process and through communicating with them. And then how are they going to communicate concerns? A lot of times we might go through the content of this and plan out what we want, how we want to, clean our bathrooms and do our dishes. But how do we want to be communicated with if a concern arises? So really challenging residents to identify and think about themselves, just as we did today. Now, we might not have time to give them a conflict assessment and do a deep dive into it, but just a general question to them. How do they like to be communicated with? So sometimes people want that direct face-to-face communication. Sometimes people need maybe a note or a text in advance so they can process things a little bit. Certainly we don't want to encourage passive communication or passive aggressiveness, but recognizing that different people might need time before they come to face-to-face, which is always best, social distantly of course, to talk about things. And then lastly, is there true agreement? How do we know? How do you really know that everybody agrees to it? Well, one of those ways is being able to follow up and check in with people even afterwards. Lastly, just a little purposeful pause here on the side. Just a couple questions to consider is one, how will RAs go about setting up roommate agreements this year? So think about the process, not just what we do when we get to the agreement, but How do you want to do that? Do you want to have residents sign up with you, or are you going to try and bounce around rooms when you're on call, or how are you going to go about that? And I'm sure you'll work within your staffs or within your hall director, resident director to get some ideas and best practices. And then I know that they're not there with you necessarily right now, but what role will the inclusion assistant or CCA maybe have too in that process, as they can be valuable with that as well. Great. So before we jump into some best practices or strategies or ideas for roommate mediations once conflict has occurred, I want you to take a pause and share with each other some of those best ideas or ways you've gone about setting up roommate agreements. So if you can, take a pause and do that, and then we'll just jump right back into this slide and move towards mediation. Awesome. So hopefully you got some great insights from one another as each community, while we have a lot of things in common, there are some great things that we can do that are a little bit different to help each other. And so one of our last things we're going to do before we practice here in a few minutes is talk about how we can develop some skills around the mediation. So we did the roommate agreement, things are going well, and inevitably, boom, some conflicts come up. Residents maybe have tried to handle it on their own. Um, Maybe that didn't go so well, or maybe they think they tried to handle it and they really didn't. Who knows? But they come to you, and it's time now for you to get involved because there's obviously a concern, there's emotion, there's a lot going on there. So it's time for you to step up and get in there and help out. So we're going to use the same kind of model that we did before with like the environment, the agreement steps, and debriefing to talk through what are some ways that you can work through doing this with your residents and being as effective as we're all developing those facilitation skills. So first, we're going to talk about environmental setup. So this is super critical, especially when there's a conflict, because right now at this point, this is when the residents are really paying attention to you and who you're spending your time with, recognizing you may have some closer relationships with some residents in the room over others. That is okay. We know that's going to naturally happen, but how do you work really carefully to make sure everybody feels like you care about them and care about their perspective? So one thing we really strongly want to emphasize is meeting with every resident one-on-one in advance. Meeting with every resident to listen to them, to ask them about those concerns beforehand. I suggest you do it not maybe right before, right? Giving a little time so that you can process or maybe even consult with other staff or with your hall director if needed, or resident director, to get some advice once you have the full scope of the problem or the challenge that maybe that room's going through. So again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to meet one-on-one with people in advance. It helps makes residents feel like they can trust you, that you're on their side, that you're looking out for the best interests of them, but also everybody in the room. So it helps go in with a neutral and caring perspective to start with. Next, as you get ready for that, take some time going back to our cultural competence comments earlier to really reflect and think about the identities and the cultures at play in the room. Maybe what's the root? Is that part of the process? Is that part of the challenge? I think in some way, shape, or form, our identities and our culture always plays a role. Sometimes it can be a simple misunderstanding, and sometimes it can be something far more deeply rooted. But it's so important to take the time to reflect on identities and also reflect on the identities you're bringing into the space and how that might influence or maybe give you a lens on the situation. As we shared in that first side, think through both content and process. Sometimes roommate agreements or roommate disagreements don't always come at the most convenient time, and so I noticed that we all, myself included, when I hear this, sometimes I'm like, oh, I just want to get through this, and I really need to slow down and kind of center myself and not just worrying about the content and rushing it, but really thinking deeply about the process and holding both as equally important. So again, I know when I tend to get to this, I want to get to it, I want to get through it, but I really want to make sure I'm acknowledging that process part. Making sure you revisit the agreement in advance so that you remember what some of that content was, because people always like to go back to those agreements, even though we know that really most times the conflicts aren't necessarily just about the things that are written in an agreement, but they're things that emotionally have happened in some harm or some unmet needs. But it's still good to be knowledgeable about that, and make sure you have that, because it's going to be a very useful tool to use as you facilitate working towards restoring that relationship and working towards problem solving once you work through the emotional aspect of it. And last but not least, do not let avoidance get in the way. So I find that people really have a lot of things to do or come up with a lot of other commitments when we're talking about conflicts. It's natural and normal for people to want to avoid this, but please, don't be the staff member who never took the time to really follow up. We want to empower residents and we want them to take ownership, but a lot of times they just might not be there yet. So, yes, they need to do that. Yes, they need to communicate, but make sure you follow through and make sure without any doubt that you've done everything that you can to ensure that this roommate situation or issue is dealt with and they feel cared for. And whether it's minor or seems maybe unimportant, what's important to other people should feel important to us too. And when we don't make them feel that way, it definitely impacts the trust that we have. So again, don't let avoidance get in the way. And if you're struggling with that, there's some creative approaches I'm sure your hall directors or other staff members and residence director can give to you as well. So that's a little bit about the environment, and it's similar, the principles of last time to make sure you think about space, setup, whether online or in person. So the agreement steps. So this one is very, very important to read through and think through. Acknowledge the conflict and name it. So don't be afraid to kind of open up and, set a tone, but being able to name it, not naming everyone's stories or everyone's perspectives, but just naming that there is in fact a conflict, because that can be really difficult. Set some ground rules. One of my favorite ones is using I statements, meaning saying like I feel, taking ownership of your own feelings and how that is affecting the situation, rather than saying you make me angry because of this. You can say I feel upset when you don't take out the trash because I feel like you don't care about us or our room. So taking time to use I statements is very powerful and very effective, and even in the most emotionally charged situations, I have seen this be extremely helpful. Maybe consider journaling if it's really tense. Perhaps you can bring some paper and let people journal out some feelings, get some stuff out there. Let them, think through what are some goals they have for the conversation, what do they want out of it. So journaling can be really helpful. One thing that we really want to emphasize in this training overall with you and development is ensuring impact is shared and change things up if the style is needed. So giving space and holding space to ensure the impact is talked about. It's so, so important. And lastly, we want you to, again, go back to that being compassionate, being neutral, and mindful of nonverbals and emotions, making sure as best we can that people are communicating to each other and that impacted parties are able to share that and share that in a way that the other folks who have caused that harm can really see and feel and experience that, and hopefully working towards those individuals who've maybe caused harm being able to take ownership and work towards restoration by their acknowledgement of that towards the person they've caused harm to or people they've caused harm to. And that is complicated and far too long of a process to probably share in this presentation, but just this idea that skill development, that is hard and long and can be difficult, and we thank you for remember, we're not just navigating like the problem or the challenge, we're navigating emotions and centering in that and remembering it takes some time and energy to navigate emotions. All right, and lastly, we want to make sure we're debriefing. One thing I always do, have closing remarks. Give everybody a chance to say something. I always ask people to think of one or two things they need to be able to effectively or to constructively live in the room, and two things they want to give. So two things maybe they want to work on or things they can do better. Again, even in really electrically charged emotional rooms, this has been really effective for me and helped residents kind of get to a good place where everybody's giving and taking, and kind of getting more on the same page. You can ask them how they think what they think and how they feel when you get towards that end about the content, the process. Maybe that's one-on-one, maybe that's in the group. And then the last but not least, establish a time to meet again. I think we can do some great work in here in a mediation, but if we don't take the time to touch base again and to really center in that, making them agree to a time before they leave, you might run into some challenges that way, because then there's no follow-up and it might feel like it was just an empty conversation, and I'm sure you don't want to feel that way after that time is invested. So that's a lot. Take a few minutes to digest that and think about which of these things really stuck out to you. So again, I'm going to ask you to pause this slide and chat with someone next to you or chat within your staff, and I want you to share one aha moment you had listening to some tips and skill sets for facilitating roommate negotiations.
Practice time! So we're going to have you all watch a few videos, and then you're going to share your thoughts about said videos, and then we're going to move into a little bit of actual practice of proactive versus reactive conflict resolution skills. The first video is a clip from The Office, which you may or may not have seen before. The second video is Brain Pop Does Conflict Resolution. We think this might be a great resource to even send out to residents in the future.
Awesome. So thank you for listening and watching our videos and really trying to take in some of the skill development. And again, if we were in person, we would have loved to do some of that a little bit more hands-on. So thanks for being understanding of that, as I know you all have been so wonderful taking in a lot of visual and auditory information the last few days, and we're trying to provide more active ways for you to learn, and that's what we're going to be doing right now, is transitioning to that active application. So what we're going to do is we're going to have staff write up situations to model at least one of these proactive and reactive mediation pieces. The reason why we want you to do it is, although we could come up with some cool scenarios, we think y'all are way more creative and will have more fun with it. But when I do say that, I want us to be conscious of not, citing real life examples that maybe are leading or share personal information. We want to be mindful of confidentiality and, being protective of other people. So we want to be creative yet thoughtful and keep it classy, if you will, because we don't want to be leading those situations and sharing things that we don't need to be shared. So I trust you all can do that, and that's why we decided to go this route. So again, we did list some ideas of conflicts you could choose from. Again, there's a list there that you can look at, because conflict permeates all areas of our life. But knowing that we focus this a lot on resident conflict, we encourage you to at least do one of the two with residents. But if, depending on where your staff is at and what you think is best for you all, you could choose one of those other ones. But we are encouraging you to focus a little bit more on the resident conflicts, is that where most of our skills and most of the facilitation conversation was around. So one of those, the proactive, would be the roommate agreement meeting. That first one is you're going to be doing that in the next few weeks. It'd be great to see a model of that. And the reactive is meeting with all roommates post-conflict. So meaning there's a conflict, you get them together, and again, you're going to facilitate that roommate renegotiation. So again, I'm going to switch to the next slide here in a second. We're going to talk about that and give you some guided questions for debriefing and how you can set these up, and then we'll wrap up from there. So before we let you go and start working on your scenes and this great work you're going to do here in a few minutes, we just wanted to share what the questions were and make sure, again, we reframe what this is. So again, we want you to write scenarios out with the conflict that you come up with, again, keeping it classy and confidential, and then you're going to switch those conflicts with another person or another group. Again, I encourage you to think maybe a little bit more by group, although everybody could write the conflict scenario. A way you could do it is everybody writes it, they get switched around, you break into groups, and then the groups could, depending on time, could act out or plan to act out each of the scenes. So then there's some different opportunities to practice, or the group could pick one of the scenes and just do that one. They could vote on one of them that they really like and use that one as a way to show that and display that. And the hope in those scenes is you answer these questions, but also think back to some of those principles of conflict, the cultural and identity considerations, and with the hidden Mickey slides, thinking about what are some of those skills and some of those practices in there that you could incorporate into it so that you're really giving you, but also your staff, an example of how to actually implement it, right? Because it's one thing to sit and listen to it. It's another thing to actually flush out communicating that and practicing that. So I ask you to do that and to take at least a few of those strategies and practice them as best you can, because we know that they're just practice scenarios, right? So that's going to be the rest of our time. We're not going to come back together, as we think that the debrief you're going to have after you do the practice and do the scenes and answer these questions will really lead itself to that closure, and also give staffs an opportunity to kind of personalize that a little bit more, maybe sharing what are some themes of conflict or things that have worked really well in your own communities. So as we wrap up here for our section and break you up into that, we thank you for spending time, a lot of time with us. Again, we thank you for listening so well. We know these are wonderfully long and information-packed days. We appreciate you. We appreciate what you're doing. And we know this topic in particular can be really tough, and it's one that requires a lot of skill development. I know it's something I'm still working on. I think we're all still working on, so that we can be great facilitators and help other people, but also for ourselves. This conflict is, again, a natural, normal part of life. It can be complicated, emotional, and it has a lot of different components to it. So thank you so much for really engaging in this, and we hope that you have a really meaningful discussion and some practice with your staff. Take care, and I'm sure we'll see you around. Bye!